So, former President Trump just gave this pretty significant address from the Oval Office, and it covered a lot of ground, everything from the war in Ukraine to the situation at the U.S. border. Today, we're going to deconstruct it, piece by piece. We'll break down the key claims and the big policy announcements he made, so you can see exactly what was said and why it's so important. All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll set the stage and look at the ceremony itself. Then, we'll get into his update on the diplomatic efforts in Ukraine. After that, we are going to dive deep into the claims about the southern border and his, well, pretty dramatic reframing of the fentanyl crisis. And finally, we'll pull it all together and summarize the biggest takeaways from the entire address. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the setting. This wasn't just your typical policy speech from behind a podium. No, this was deliberately framed as a ceremony to honor military service members, and that really set a specific tone for all the announcements that came later. And just look at who was in the room. The former president surrounded himself with some really key figures. You've got military leaders, the attorney general, the head of the DEA. Their presence alone was a huge signal, immediately underscoring the main themes of the day: national security and law enforcement.
So the centerpiece of this whole thing was the Mexican Border Defense Medal, and it was pointed out that this was actually a revival of an award from way back in 1918, a move that was clearly meant to link what's happening now at the border to a piece of American military history from over a century ago.
All right, so after that ceremonial opening, the address took a big turn onto the global stage. The former president gave what he presented as a major update on the war in Ukraine.
He reported that he'd had a whole series of conversations with a long list of world leaders. And we're talking about everyone. He mentioned speaking with both President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia, plus the heads of major European powers and key NATO countries.
And his take on all these talks? Well, it was incredibly optimistic. He flat out declared that a resolution to the conflict was closer than it has ever been, basically positioning his administration's diplomatic push as the key to, in his words, save a lot of lives.
Okay, so after talking about what's happening overseas, the speech really pivoted to what was clearly the main event, the U.S. southern border. And here, he presented this narrative of a massive, dramatic transformation. He painted this incredibly stark picture. The border he said he inherited was, and I quote, surrendered to criminals, drug cartels, human traffickers. But the border after his policies were put in place, he called it the strongest border in the history of our country. A huge contrast. Now, to back this up, he made a really specific and honestly pretty bold claim. He said that for the past 7 months, the total number of illegal aliens admitted into the United States was 0. And it didn't stop there. He also threw out another big number on interdiction, stating that drug trafficking coming into the country by sea had plummeted by a staggering 94%.
So how did this all happen according to him? Well, this dramatic turnaround was attributed to one major action: deploying over 25,000 service members to the border. He described them as warriors who were carrying out a truly historic operation. Right, so you're probably wondering, how exactly was this all accomplished? Well, the address laid out a few specific policies. He talked about ending catch and release, making sure anyone crossing illegally faced immediate deportation or imprisonment, and, this is a big one, officially designating the drug cartels as terrorist organizations. And it wasn't just him saying this. This feeling was definitely echoed by others in the room. Tom Homan, a former acting director of ICE, gave this really definitive statement. He said he toured hundreds of miles of the border and hadn't seen a single illegal alien. You know, it makes sense that the conversation about border security would lead right into the fentanyl crisis. But this wasn't framed as just a drug problem. No, the address explicitly presented it as a direct, weaponized threat against the entire nation. And to really hammer home just how big this problem is, the former president announced what he called the largest fentanyl bust in U.S. history, a single operation that seized 3 million pills. And check out this quote. It's a really powerful analogy he used to drive home the drug's lethality. He argued its impact was even worse than a conventional weapon of war, estimating it was causing something like 200,000 to 300,000 deaths a year. So all of this language, the analogies, it was all building up to the biggest policy announcement of the address, a new executive order, which he signed right there during the event, that formally classifies fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. Okay, so that was a lot. Let's take a second and just recap the central pillars of this Oval Office address.
So as we've walked through, the address laid out this narrative of a total transformation at the border. You see how it all connects, right? That border security part ties directly into the fight against fentanyl, which got elevated to this whole other level by being classified as a WMD. Then on the world stage, the message was that peace in Ukraine is right around the corner. And all of the domestic policy stuff was supported by that new designation of drug cartels as terrorist organizations, which just opens up a whole new playbook for how to respond.
And at the end of the day, he boiled down his entire argument on immigration to one simple line, summarizing his administration's official stance. Legal immigration is welcome, but illegal entry just won't be tolerated.
And that really leaves us with a massive question to think about. I mean, calling a drug a weapon of mass destruction, that's a completely unprecedented move. So what does it actually mean to do that? What kind of new powers does this classification unlock for the government, both at home and abroad? And you gotta wonder, what might the unintended consequences be?